It is the year 202 BC on the plains of Zama, North Africa. The final showdown of one of history's greatest conflicts, the Second Punic War, was about to unfold. The two colossal superpowers of antiquity, the Roman Republic and the Carthaginian Empire, met face to face on the battlefield. The two forces had been entangled in a prolonged and bloody war for the past 16 years, with no end in sight. The Romans, led by their experienced and competent commander, Publius Cornelius Scipio, fielded a force of about 35,000 to 40,000 troops. Scipio arrayed his men in the Roman Republic's standard triplex axis formation, which was not only standard, but successfully battle-tested during the times of the Roman Republic. Leading the forefront of the Roman army, the Velites skirmishers, the youngest recruits in the army. The first line of Roman infantry, the hastati, were slightly older with minimal to some experience in battle. These men were capable in hand-to-hand combat. At the center and core of the Roman Republic's army were the principes. These men were battle-tested, experienced and well-armed for combat. The final line were the triarii, the elite soldiers of the Roman Republic's army. These men were the trusted backbone of the Roman army, and only ever entered the fighting if a Roman army was struggling. In an odd turn of events, Scipio had acquired the services of the Numidians. Their leader, Massinissa, had become the leading Numidian ruler and ally of Rome after Scipio's successful invasion of Carthage a few years prior. The Numidian cavalry were stationed on the right flank. Roman and Italian cavalry were positioned on the left flank. Although not as famed as their Numidian allies, the Roman and Italian cavalry were, however, better armed and armored, and had plentiful experience from Scipio's successful Iberian campaign against the Carthaginians. Opposing Scipio and the Roman army was the legendary Carthaginian general Hannibal Barca. Now well into his 40s, he was still a capable commander. He commanded a slightly larger force of about 40,000 to 45,000 troops. The center of Hannibal's army consisted of 3 separate divisions of infantry and was made up of multiple different ethnic groups that he had typically utilized throughout the Second Punic Wars. At the forefront of the Carthaginian center were the ever-dangerous African war elephants, a stable regiment of Hannibal's army during the time. The first line of infantry consisted of Celtic and Gallic mercenaries, who tended to be a staple of Hannibal's field armies when facing the Romans. They were fierce warriors who harbored a natural hatred for Romans due to their many conflicts over the years. Hannibal's corps and second line was made up of Libyan and African troops that were newly recruited to his army. Like the Gauls and Celts, these men were typically a staple in Hannibal's army, although their lack of experience was something of a concern when facing Scipio's Romans. The third and final line is where Hannibal had placed his most elite and best troops. These men were exceptionally armored and equipped. They had been fighting in Hannibal's armies since the outbreak of the Second Punic War 16 years prior, thus making them some of the most experienced and fiercest soldiers throughout the Mediterranean. Positioned on his right flank were a few thousand of his Libyan cavalry. This was the first time to date where Hannibal had entered a battle against the Romans without having his renowned Numidian cavalry in his ranks. Positioned on his right flank were a few thousand Iberian and Carthaginian cavalry. Hannibal's cavalry was not elite by any standard, but historically, he had never really fielded heavy nor elite cavalry in his armies during his prior successes against the Romans in battle. The time had come. Hannibal gave the signal. His heavy African war elephants advanced in lockstep. The ground quaked and vibrated with the sheer mass of 80 elephants slowly stomping against the dry surface. The Romans watched on as the sea of thick grey hides came advancing toward them. Scipio gave the signal. His men broke from their checkerboard formation into a straight patterned line with large gaps forming between each section of infantry. This was Scipio's response to deal with the threat of Hannibal's elephants. As the elephants closed in, the Roman velites strategically pull back between the gaps in the Roman formation toward the very back. Scipio's plan was to not frighten the beasts, thus enticing them to run straight through the open gaps in the ranks without causing any damage to his own troops. Scipio had figured out that if elephants are given an opportunity to avoid conflict and given a path to safety, they will always take the path to safety. Although Scipio's plan works exceptionally well, a few handful of elephants stray from the path and become entangled with Roman troops. The velites at the rear take no chances, and loose javelins into the ranks of elephants, bringing down many of the beasts. The Roman triarii used their sharp, pointed spears to make quick work of any remaining elephants who had not escaped. Without pause, the Roman flank, where the Numidian contingents led by Massinissa, rapidly advanced forward toward Hannibal's left flank. The swiftness of the Numidians was unlike any other cavalry riders on the field. They quickly closed the distance and began skirmishing Hannibal's Libyan cavalry. Their light riders encircled the Libyans, throwing spears and javelins, dismounting their enemies, whilst their heavier riders charged in and held them in place. The Romans, having superior cavalry numbers, stockpiled with their superior cavalry riders in the Numidians, made quick work of Hannibal's Libyans. Realizing his men were fighting a losing battle, Hannibal signaled for his left flank to retreat. It was reported that Hannibal did this, as he did not want to have his left flank destroyed so early on in the battle. Or perhaps this was part of his plan to draw away the superior Numidian cavalry from the battlefield. The latter of the two seeming like a more plausible reason, given that Hannibal was a tactical genius in warfare. On the opposite end, the two remaining cavalry forces charged at one another. The Roman-Italian cavalry were confident, being that they were more heavily armored with hard metal helmets and iron chainmail shirts in comparison to their lighter-equipped Carthaginian foes. It would all but seem as though the gods of war were not on Hannibal's side that day. His right flank, too, became overwhelmed, and he signaled for them to retreat. Although, as discussed previously, this may have been part of his plan all along, to send the Roman cavalry on a frivolous chase, drawing them all away from the field, thus allowing Hannibal's numerically superior infantry to fight the Roman infantry unhindered, thus favoring the Carthaginians. Whatever the case, the battle now came down to the infantry. Hannibal ordered forth his front lines of Gallic and Celtic mercenaries, whilst Scipio met the challenge by advancing his front lines of Hastati to meet them. The Hastati advanced in a disciplined and well-organized formation. From afar, it would have appeared as though a sea of bronze was marching in lockstep. Thousands of infantry locked eyes and advanced fearlessly in each other's direction. The Roman Hastati, bringing their throwing pila within distance of the enemy lines, loosed them, causing sheer chaos throughout Hannibal's first line. Many at the front who were not struck down had to drop their shields. As the pilas had become so deeply embedded in them, they were now too heavy or awkward to carry. The Carthaginian front line came smashing into the Romans. A massive and bloody melee erupted. As time passed, the Hastati found themselves on the winning side, their cohesion and discipline outwitting their lighter Celtic and Gallic foes. The persistence of the Hastati bore fruit. They outwitted their Gallic and Celtic foes and sent them fleeing from the engagement. Hannibal's mercenaries fled back behind the safety of their second line. However, before the Hastati at the front line had any chance to rest or even catch their breath, they were set upon by Hannibal's second line of African and Libyan troops. Tired and having sustained losses, the Hastati prepared themselves to face a larger force of fresher troops. Some historians speculate that upon fleeing, the Celtic and Gallic mercenaries were attacked and cut down by Hannibal's second line as punishment for their cowardice behavior. However, this theory seems unlikely, as to potentially risk losing more troops in the midst of a heated battle does not seem logical, especially considering how Hannibal conducted himself on the battlefield. Scipio opted to not reinforce his front line immediately. He wanted to hold as many men in reserve as he could, as he knew Hannibal's veterans at the rear were a real danger. So he proceeded to cautiously monitor the situation until he deemed it utterly necessary to commit more troops to the engagement. It didn't take long. The Hastati, tired, outnumbered, and outmatched, soon began to lose ground, and losses began to stack. Scipio knew he had no choice now but to reinforce his front line, or otherwise risk losing it entirely. He gave the signal. The experienced Principes stepped forward and marched toward their fellow comrades' aid. With the assistance from the Principes, Scipio was able to completely turn the tide of the engagement. The Libyan and African infantry were outmatched. They retreat back behind the safety of their third line. However well-meaning the minor triumph, this engagement came at a cost to Scipio's army, with the vast majority of his Hastati having fallen in the two initial melee struggles, as well as a sizable portion of his Principes. The Libyan and African infantry that had fled regained their composure and regrouped on the flanks of Hannibal's third line. The full might of the Carthaginian army was yet to be unleashed on the Romans. Scipio was well aware. In response, he ordered forth his seasoned veterans, the Triarii, to reinforce the remainder of the Roman line. Together they formed into one massive line to meet the length of Hannibal's. By this stage, both forces were relatively even in their numbers, with the odds favoring Hannibal's seasoned veteran elite troops, who had seen battles all across the entirety of the 16-year-long Second Punic War. The odds were even more skewed, especially now considering the Roman cavalry had left the battle and were no longer in play. It is fair to assume this is how Hannibal would have strategized the battle playing out in his favor. With the Roman and Numidian cavalry still possibly lingering, Hannibal wanted to initiate the battle quickly. He knew if he could defeat the remainder of Scipio's infantry fast enough, then he could turn and face a potential flanking or encircling maneuver attempt by the enemy cavalry. All was going according to Hannibal's plan, his veterans cutting their way through the Roman lines. Publius Cornelius Scipio, who was rumored to have escaped the Battle of Cannae 14 years earlier, at a crushing defeat at the hands of Hannibal, had learned from his respected adversary. He too learned the patience of timing and allowing your enemy to believe that they have you exactly where they want you. Hannibal's gravest nightmare was to show its face. The Roman and Numidian cavalry had indeed returned to the battlefield. By this stage, Hannibal had committed all of his men, and now he, for once, was to be the one on the receiving end of what he had done to the Romans for so many years. The impact of the cavalry charge was devastating. Surrounded on all sides, Hannibal's veterans fought to the last, but the trap was complete. Thousands were cut down, and the battlefield dissolved into slaughter. Hannibal himself barely escaped, gathering a few horsemen and fleeing toward Carthage. The legendary Carthaginian general who had pulled this exact maneuver on the Romans countless times was now utterly defeated in the same fashion. The Battle of Zama was a catastrophe for Carthage. Some 20,000 Carthaginians lay dead, and another 20,000 were captured. There are many different reports on the Roman losses. Given the extent and struggle of the battle, the numbers would be relatively high also. Hannibal returned to Carthage and urged the Senate to sue for peace. The terms were harsh. Carthage surrendered its fleet, paid an enormous indemnity, and pledged never again to wage war without Rome's permission. For Hannibal, Zama was the end of his dream of breaking Rome's dominance over the Mediterranean. For Scipio, it was the crowning glory of his career, earning him the name Africanus. And for Rome, it marked the beginning of unchallenged supremacy in the Mediterranean.